everyone. You are listening to another episode of the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. I'm your host, Jeanene Wolfe, and today I'm joined by Dr. Keith Klosterman. Dr. Klosterman is a quality assurance manager at the Cohen Veterans Network, also known as CVN. He is licensed as a mental health counselor and marriage and family therapist in New York State and is an AAMFT approved supervisor. He has achieved a lot in his career. He's won numerous awards for his work, and I encourage you to check out the show notes so that you can learn a little bit more about him. And today we're going to talk about intimate partner violence, which is a widespread issue, as you shared with me, Keith, that affects millions of people in the world. So welcome. I'm so happy to have you on.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here and really excited to talk about this topic because I think it's so important.
I agree, absolutely. And I think that really came to a forefront for a lot of people during the pandemic when people were stuck at home and didn't have the ability to get away at times and be safe.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because I can remember thinking about, you would see those PSAs on TV or you'd hear them on the radio about, just stay home with your family and play a board game. And it was this sort of really rosy visual of what it should look like. But there was a whole host of people where it wasn't that. And it was actually more family time was actually scary and dangerous.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So can you define, and I know this is kind of a really broad question, but can you define intimate partner violence?
Yeah, sure. So I think intimate partner violence, and people often use the term domestic violence with it interchangeably, encompasses a variety of factors. So there's physical abuse, there's emotional abuse, financial abuse, sexual abuse, and so on. And I think it really sort of encompasses this wide range of behaviors where one partner is seeking to control the other. Although having said that, what I will say is that although we often think of violence as sort of this homogeneous phenomenon, kind of a one size fits all, it really comes in all shapes and sizes. And in my opinion, based on the work that I've done, I think it's best viewed on a continuum, ranging from non-severe, what we might call non-severe violence on one end to the more extreme violence on the other end. So, and we can certainly talk about that, as much or as little as you'd like.
Okay, absolutely. Yeah. And so the more I do this podcast, the more I realize there are some really critical areas in our work that we need to have at least a basic understanding, because we know that clients don't always come in telling you what they need, and they may never. Hopefully you establish enough trust that eventually they do. So I think it's important that our listeners hear what you have to say today, because even if this is not their primary population, they will surely come across this at some time in their career.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that up. I think that we know when we look at the statistics that over 25% of women will experience some form of partner violence in their lifetime. For men, that statistic is lower. It's at 20%. So we know that there's a significant proportion of the population that is dealing with this phenomenon. We also know that among certain groups or subgroups that the rates are even higher, right? So depending on ethnicity, depending on culture, depending on sexuality, that the rates may even be higher. And what we know is actually typically that whatever the number we think it is, it's probably even higher than what we think because it tends to be underreported. And I say that in the context of, there's a lot of push to do more couples and family work in a lot of organizations. But I think with that comes the importance of doing exactly what you're talking about, Jeanene, which is, look, we have to be aware that this exists. And we also have an opportunity to screen people to make sure that they're in a safe environment.
Right. Yeah. I was sharing with another guest recently that I'm always like, well, this should be a question on your intake. And I'm like, I say this about so many different things that it's impossible to have everything on your intake. And so I've sort of settled for myself, and I'd love to hear your thoughts with letting them know that there are lots of different things we can discuss in here. And this is a safe place for you to do this so that you're setting that tone, whether it be what you're talking about today or some of these other things that we've discussed on this podcast.
I completely agree. And I can appreciate, I think that sometimes the paperwork and the documentation pieces can feel a bit overwhelming.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I found in my career is when I first graduated with my doctorate, after I graduated, I spent 10 years working on federally funded clinical trials looking at family treatments for substance abuse. What we found was that even though it wasn't a primary outcome that we were looking at, that a lot of clients were reporting that they had been violent toward their partners. But the only reason we were capturing it was because we were doing these research protocols. And so it really required taking a step back and saying, well, how can we more efficiently and accurately capture what's going on besides a single question on an intake of, have you ever hit your partner or something to that extent, right? Because, I mean, most people are going to say, well, no, I've never been violent, because their definition of violent may be very different than what we're talking about, right? So I think it's really important to be purposeful and deliberate and explicit in terms of doing what you're talking about, which is, look, to having the conversation about creating a safe space. This can be a safe space for us to talk about what's going on. And it really is an opportunity to possibly provide assistance in that area. But I think you have to specifically ask about it, and there's wider ranging implications for, one of the things that we know is that couples treatments, let's say, for what we would consider, and I don't know if the term's the greatest, but non-severe forms of violence. And when I say that, what I'm really referring to is an isolated instance of a push or a shove. The violence in general isn't being used as a form of power and control. There's no fear of partner per se, and it's bidirectional, right? So somebody's trying to get by somebody else, it escalates, and somebody pushes somebody, but it's not frequent and ongoing. In those cases, couples treatments can be very effective in terms of helping people, right? Teaching skills, conflict resolution skills, and communication and problem solving. With the other kind of violence, which is the more extreme type, Michael Johnson, who's a researcher out of Penn State, refers to the more severe type as intimate terrorism, right? And what that means is, the violence is being used as a form of power and control. It's frequent, it's ongoing. It tends to be, the injuries associated with it tend to be more severe. It ends up in hospitalization, and it's predominantly male perpetrated. In those cases, when you have that, you should never, ever, ever do couples therapy, right? Because you're putting somebody at risk. I say all this in the context of, it speaks to the importance of really carefully screening people to make sure that, yes, sometimes couples come in, and I've seen this in my own work where we've done an initial screening and they met the criteria for the intimate terrorism, the more severe type. Mm-hmm. And we had to have a conversation about, well, this probably isn't the best format for you. And I've had partners say to me, look, we're going to stay together. We want to do this anyway, right? So sometimes it's not just an academic exercise. It has real world implications for individuals and their families, and especially kids in the home.
And as therapists, providers, we really sometimes struggle with those things. Like, this person's having this horrific life, and I would love to support them in getting out of this relationship. But we also ultimately have to respect that it's their choice. And so we're going to meet them where they're at and provide support in the best way that we can.
Yeah, I completely agree. I often think that we only see a snapshot of our clients' lives, and they come in and they've lived with these things for quite some time. And they've probably had lots of people in their lives telling them what they should and shouldn't do. And it hasn't worked, right? Which is why they've come to us. And so sometimes us trying to understand, where they're coming from, and also just figuring out how can we help them, right? Be that as it may, if this is your decision, how can I support you? How can I make sure you're safe? Right? Or how can we continue this conversation that maybe opens up possibilities for doing something different when that person's ready?
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. So can you give us an idea of what are some of the more subtle signs that a therapist might be seeing with a client that makes them think, okay, I need to keep an eye out for this. I need to maybe not address it right away, but create a more heightened sense of awareness of what's going on with this client?
Yeah, sure. I think that for me, sometimes nonverbals in session, the way somebody is sitting with one partner is consistently responding for the other person. If there's discussion, even just like little bits and pieces of problems that occurred and maybe they get shut off, or I notice that one partner's giving the other one a look about this isn't okay to talk about, or I can sort of see things escalating in the session. For me, those are all red flags. In and of themselves or taken in isolation doesn't mean that somebody is necessarily violent. But I do think it's something that I tend to keep in the back of my mind. And if I further suspect, let's say, we're all therapists, and sometimes you get that gut feeling like there's more to this story, right? There's something that's not being said. I've separated partners for sessions to say, hey, I like to sometimes get each of your views individually. And so that provides me the opportunity to say, well, what is going on? Or I just have this feeling, right? To be curious about whether it's conflict resolution or something that I've noticed. So, when I hear stories about when it feels like somebody's being isolated, right? Either physically or financially, those controlling behaviors are a sign that something else could be happening. So I think it's sort of listening for those things.
Yeah, and so in individual therapy, then it's less about observing the interactions of the couples. It's more about hearing these little nuances in the way they discuss things.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it also provides an opportunity that in the event something was going on to say, well, how can we what are you doing now? How can we make sure you're safe? Right? How can I help you? How can I support you? It allows me to assess for the extent that the violence, how long it's been going on, is there fear of partner, all these things, right? I can begin to sort of formulate that and then share my concerns. And that's really what they are, right? It's not for me to tell somebody what to do, but I can share that I'm worried and I'm concerned and I want to figure out the best way to help and support you in this process.
Mhm. Right. So giving them that understanding again about the safe space. But I believe there's probably times where you need to do a lot of psychoeducation for people to even understand that what they're experiencing is not okay.
Yeah, for sure. Because I think sometimes it becomes normalized to the extent of this is just the way it is. And sometimes having conversations about, whether or not this is healthy and does it really have to be this way? Right. And are there options? Are there alternatives? Because I do think that for some people, you can end up in this vortex where it's sort of hard to see a bigger picture. And all you know is that sort of world where this is acceptable behavior and this is what you know, and this is how we interact. So I think like those conversations have to be delicate and gentle. And I think meeting somebody where they're at and not in a punitive way, like, how could you do this? Or why are you allowing? I think it's more about helping somebody to recognize, look, there's a bigger picture to this and there are options, and then collaboratively figuring out what that is.
Yeah, so I would imagine this work more so than maybe other areas of treatment. You really have to go in stages and kind of ease into this. And so if you get someone to the point where, okay, they're acknowledging this is happening, you're saying, how can I support you? Is a safety plan something you use with these clients?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's figuring out, does the client feel safe? What are some options, right, in terms of a safety plan? Even being thoughtful about what form will the safety plan take, right? Is it paper and pencil? Is it digital? Like what's it gonna look like? I think that part of the process has to be really collaborative in nature because as therapists, we can develop the greatest safety plan in the world, right? This is what you should do, all these things. But if our clients aren't willing to do it, then its value is useless, right? It's just an exercise that maybe makes us feel better in the moment, like, hey, we did something. But I think it's really important to make sure that however you develop that they are things that your client's willing to do. I think in general, the more behaviorally descriptive the safety plan is, the more likely people are to follow through rather than just sort of these vagaries of, oh, I'll just call a friend. Who is that friend? Write the number down and so on. And then where are you going to put this? Where will you keep it? You know,
Mhm.
if the violence is very extreme, having some kind of like go bag of having necessities of things that you need just in case, heaven forbid, you ever have to use it, but you've got things that you can take with you to get away in the moment and where you could go. So I think all of those things have to be considered.
And I think telehealth lends itself to opening the door to this a little bit earlier on when I'm doing my initial intake with someone and we're going over the ins and outs of telehealth and what that looks like and what, what might go wrong and how we're going to manage it. And part of me is explaining that I cannot control the privacy on your end. So let's talk about what that looks like, and that if you ever feel unsafe, you can just end the session. You can message me in the Zoom, in the Zoom platform.
Yes.
And I've really never people are just like, thank you for telling me that. And, I've not had a client yet say, oh my gosh, no, that's I think they, if nothing else, maybe know somebody in their lives who've been in this experience and they appreciate the information.
Yeah. I'm so glad to hear you say that, right? You're really thoughtful and careful when you're doing telehealth about, hey, I just want you to know this, right? You're making it explicit. It's not being assumed. I was just having a conversation with a colleague about this yesterday, just in terms of telehealth. And sometimes we make an assumption that telehealth, there's a seamless transition, right? From meeting face to face to doing telehealth. Well, just do it online, right? But there's all of these kinds of factors that have to be considered. And even I think it's your approach is respectful in saying, look, this is a safe place. If you ever have to, hang up right away, I understand it. And so you're setting the ground rule right off the top. I think that's great. I think those are the kinds of conversations that we need to have more of. The data are staggering, right? They're alarming. And we know that there are lots of people that have been involved in these kinds of situations or unhealthy relationships. So I think it only makes sense that with that knowledge, we tailor our approach to be mindful of that and to account for it in the work that we do.
Yeah. And I know in therapist online world, anyway, the different places therapists meet up with other therapists, the beginning of the pandemic and then when George Floyd was murdered, it really brought to light a lot of the ways that we needed to be communicating better with our clients about safety and what's going on in the world, and that really nothing is off topic here, that we can really discuss whatever it is you need.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of transparency, and I think it's important to have these kinds of conversations in the room, because if we don't, if we're sort of missing the elephant in the room and we're skirting around or dancing around issues, we're limiting the value of the therapeutic work that we do. So I think it's really important, as you say, Jeanene, look, we should have these conversations, right? This is part of what we do, and it's okay to do that, and it's safe to do that. Because the reality is people may not feel comfortable having those kinds of conversations in other parts of their lives.
Right. Yeah. And that's really we know through research that the relationship between the therapist and the client is the number one indicator for success. And that just really speaks to, and I think hopefully all of us know that, and the importance of how you're showing up is really important. And that should not be not given enough time to present what therapy is, how you can support them, and, just really laying that groundwork for whatever it is they need.
Well, I'm so glad you said that. And I think the relationship is one of those things that we all take it for granted, right? When you ask therapists what they do or what's important, they say, well, you got to form a relationship. But it's kind of like, well, what does that mean? And according to whose perspective, right? We sort of have these ideas, well, we'll get to know somebody and they'll just open up as we get to know them. But I think there's very deliberate and intentional things that you can do to increase that engagement, right? To increase that trust and to build it over time, right? I think agreement on the means and methods of how we're going to work together, agreement on the goals, right? And that they're the client's goals, not mine,
Yeah.
and that the client feels like I get it. Like I understand where they're coming from. It doesn't matter when you look at the outcome research, what matters most is the client's perception of the alliance. And usually by the end of the second session, research has shown that after session 2, if you don't have that alliance in place, or if it's not on its way, chances of success tend to diminish. So I think, the implication of saying all this is, look, we have to be willing to ask our clients, is there something that I'm missing? Do you feel like I'm getting it? Right? Do you feel like you're making progress? Are we on the right track? And, that often doesn't happen. So I think that's the piece where it's like relationships super important, but we have to make sure that we're constantly monitoring that because it's a very dynamic construct.
Yeah, and I'm not making assumptions about it. Years ago in my career, I was working for a pediatric hospice and I was working with this mom. And, after a number of sessions, I said, hey, I think there's a resource that you might really benefit from, and gave her the information. She used the resource and she came back to me. And at the time, I was shocked. She said, that was when I really realized I could trust you. And so not taking for granted that the trust is there, that you
Yes.
have to continuously build that trust and continuously hopefully take it deeper so that they truly, so those things that they can't imagine telling anyone,
Yes.
they're like, okay, this is finally a person I can tell.
Yeah, I think that's so important, which is I'm always blown away, and I feel privileged by the fact that people come to see me and they tell me things that they may have never shared with anybody else. And we just met. And I don't ever want to lose sight of what that's like and what that means and how difficult that may be when you're just getting to know somebody, how
Mhm.
scary that can be.
Yeah.
I think your point is a good one in that oftentimes it's the little things that we do that maybe to us are don't feel like a big deal that to our clients mean so much more. I'll share a quick story. When I was training, so I was sort of trained with the use of the one-way mirror and therapy team and the whole nine yards. So it was kind of cool because you'd go in the room and you'd be working with the family and there was a phone and the family could or the team could call in with feedback. It was
Mhm.
took a little getting used to for sure. But I
Sure.
remember I was working with a family and we would meet for 40 minutes and then I'd go back and take a consultation break, talk to the team, and then go back in the room and give the family the feedback along with like some kind of home practice assignment, let's say. So I felt like the session was going really well. Like everything was just falling into place, just like it's supposed to, right? Just like in the textbook.
Right.
Go back and talk to the team saying, oh, yeah, this, that, and the other thing. And have them do this. And the homework lines up exactly with what they said. So I go back in the room feeling really good, really full of myself. I nailed it. And I remember giving the family the feedback and saying, yeah, this is what the team said. And we were thinking that maybe between now and the next time we meet, you could try this. And I remember the family just sat there and they didn't really do much. And they're giving each other the sideways glances. And I could tell like it landed really flat. And I said, well, is that something you'd be willing to do? And they kind of looked at me and they're like, no, not really. So it was like, this is great. Like what would be more helpful for you? But I
Right.
remember for me, it was really important information because it was like, I thought I had nailed it. And if they hadn't done that, if they had just shined it on and said, oh yeah, that's great, right? They would have left thinking he has no idea what he's talking about. But it was really
Right.
important for me and a reminder that we have to continuously check in, right? Regardless of how we're feeling, to check in to say, how are you experiencing this? How are you experiencing us? Does this make
Mhm.
sense?
Yeah, yeah. And those are things that, we go through stages once we are out of school where we're just we're in our heads about all the things we should be doing. And
Yes.
then we get to the point where we're like feeling a little more confident. We're like, yeah, I'm doing great with this. And then at some point, you probably get knocked down a notch because you're just feeling like I've nailed this. And we all need to be knocked down that notch every now and then. And then you get to the point where you're like, every person is very different. And this session is going to be whatever it is. And I'm going to do my very best to meet them where they're at and meet their needs and not get so hung up in all the shoulds.
Yes, I think that's so important. And, when you look at the data, it kind of supports what you're saying, Janine, which is that therapists tend to be most effective early in their careers. It may be in part because we're like hyper vigilant about, hey, I really need to pay attention to this and do this. The longer we're in the field, the more automatic the process becomes. So we don't have to think as much about it, which in some ways is great, but in other ways we sort of lose that reflective quality to our work, which is, hey, did that really work? And am I doing this right? When it gets to the point where everything is automatic for us, it's easy. But I think there's a trade off that we sometimes lose our willingness or ability to reflect on, well, is this really working and can I do it better?
Yeah, although I do have to say there's some clients that I reflect back on every now and then, and I'm like, "Oh boy, I could have done such better work with them if I knew what I knew now."
Yeah, I know. It doesn't matter how far we are in our careers, right? We look at it and we think, oh my God, I have no idea what we just talked about in there. So,
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So you mentioned like some cultural issues, socioeconomic issues, things like that. I would imagine it's more challenging with some populations within this population that are really just not going to recognize this is happening, or they're going to be very resistant to anything you have to say. So, how do you deal with those challenges?
So, this is a really difficult question. And sometimes these challenges are passed from one generation to the next, right? And
Right.
there's that family transmission component to it where this is just, this is what my dad did. And I grew up in this environment and it turned out okay. And we were a happy family. So I think that those are the kinds of conversations that have to be ongoing about, is it really working? Right? Is this really working the way you think it is? And what are the implications of that? Some for the individual, sometimes for kids, right? If there are kids in the home, sometimes it can be easier to see the negative impact that it can have on kids than it can be for somebody to say, well, I can just deal with it. Right. But when you start talking about that there's long lasting implications for my children, well, now you got my attention, right?
Yeah.
And not in a and again, not sort of in a blaming way, but just to say, well, how does this work? What's the impact? What are all these things that you have to do to, hide this or whatever it is? And is there another way of doing it? Right? What do you think? So it's not me. I can give the education. I can say I can give options. Ultimately, it's up to that person to get there. Because I think the challenge is if you push too hard, what you essentially do is you push somebody out the door, right? Because they think, "Oh, he just doesn't get it. He's not hearing
Mhm.
me." So I think that's the piece where it's hearing somebody and respecting where they're at now while also saying, look, it doesn't have to be this way. And it shouldn't be this way. And it's not helpful or healthy. A lot of times there's physical implications beyond just sort of, living in these toxic environments. People start to experience chronic health conditions as a result of that.
Yeah.
So I think, and then there's comorbid sort of, whether it's depression, anxiety that comes with it. And I think, sort of showing how all of these things can be interrelated can sometimes be powerful.
Yeah. And one of the things that I love that's changed in our field is that we have so much more diversity. It was like the white lady in the cardigan was like the typical therapist. And I think consumers are getting a lot more savvy about saying, I can actually look for someone who looks like me, who has life experiences like me, who their copy on their website really speaks to me. But we also do get clients that are referred to us that maybe we're not the best fit. So maybe if there's a cultural background to what they're experiencing, sometimes it's hard to do, but to have the courage to say, I don't know a lot about that, and I'm certainly not going to ask you to teach me. So I can do some learning on my own so I can best support you, or I can refer you to someone who might have a similar lived experience.
Absolutely. And again, I think it speaks to that transparency and authenticity. It's okay to say, geez, I don't have much experience in this area. And I think it's actually more ethical to say that than to
Mhm.
pretend that we know everything about everything. Right. I mean, there's a certain humility that comes with being able to say, look, these are my limitations. I want to make sure you have the best experience possible. And maybe I'm not that person to do that. Then that's okay. It's not about me. It's about trying to help this person and trying to direct this person to find the right resources that are available. So I think
Yeah.
there is a certain skill level with that. And it requires a humility to say, it's okay for me to say that I'm not the best person to do this. Doesn't mean I'm a bad therapist. It just
Right.
means that I'm really sort of, the focus is on making sure this person gets what she or he needs. And it's not about me.
Yeah, and I think we've come a long way in how we understand when and how to make referrals out, and I think fear underlines a lot of that. But once you can push through the fear, you can really do some really good work with understanding the issues around that.
Absolutely.
So, we talked earlier about supporting a client who says, yes, I agree with everything you're saying, but this is my relationship and I'm staying here. So, I think at that point, it must be very essential to be very clear in your mind about not victim blaming. I think that might be very easy to slip into, especially if you want to help them so badly, but they're making a choice that you wish they wouldn't make.
For sure. And I think it comes down to there's often practical considerations for why somebody is going to stay in a situation. It would be great if people could say, okay, I'm leaving and that's it. Like there's financial considerations, there's children, there could be safety and fear. People are at elevated risk when they decide they're going to leave a relationship. It's not a conversation that should be willy-nilly, right? I think there's legitimate concerns, and I think respecting that piece of it is really important, while also trying to come up with a plan to first and foremost ensure safety, and then also see, what are the options? What can you do? Maybe there are things that have to be put in place to get to where you need to be. And what are those things? Who can help? What are the resources? I also think once you become aware of it, it's incumbent on us as therapists to continuously check in on safety. It shouldn't be a one-off conversation about this is what's happening now. I think it has to be an ongoing conversation,
Right. Because
making
they may
sure that
change their mind down the road, and now they've already told you this is what they're doing, and so there's some fear maybe of saying, okay, it's gotten bad enough that I want to go in a different direction.
that's exactly right. And even just checking in on what happened since the last session. Has there been any violence? How can I support you? Yeah, and being explicit about those conversations, being sensitive and respectful, but also explicit. I want to try and figure out how I can best help and support you through this.
Yeah, and then we kind of have to wrap this up, of course, with there are some high risk populations. Well, these days I think everyone we need to be aware for our own selves of our need for self-care, and that doesn't mean a bubble bath. It means whatever self-care looks like to you, and boundary setting. And I think that maybe the boundary setting could be challenging for someone who's newer in this field with this population, thinking, well, it's my job to be there and do all the things, and it doesn't usually end well for us when that happens, or the
No, it
client.
does. Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think it's well intentioned, right? But I also think, your point about self-care is critical, more so now than ever.
Yeah.
Demand to see a provider is through the roof, which is great, right? But it comes at a cost, a personal cost to us. And I think self-care has to be authentic in the sense of it's more than just that thing we talked about in graduate school. Well, you just like you just alluded to, Janine, no, just have a bubble bath. Like it
Right.
has to be something that's meaningful. It has to be ongoing, right? We do really important work, and oftentimes our work is really stressful, and we have to take care of ourselves. And if we don't reinvest in ourselves, whether that's through, acts of self-kindness or setting boundaries and limitations, then we're going to compromise our ability as therapists. I think for a lot of therapists, we have to figure out that, or to understand it's okay to say, you know what, I'm saturated right now, right? Or I need some space for me. Doesn't mean that we're being selfish or we're bad people.
Yeah.
It just means that like we're human and we need to
Right.
be able to do that as well.
Yeah, and I think that I was listening to a podcast or something, and this was like one of those, of course, moments that it was saying that just because you're capable of working with a certain client or a certain number of clients doesn't mean you have the capacity. And that is an important indicator that, and most of us at the beginning of the pandemic brought on all kinds of clients because we were trying to meet the need, not knowing what it was going to
Yeah.
look like down the road. And so I think that those are really important. And one of the things that I share with my consultation group members is, if you have one of these cases where every week you look at your schedule and you're like, oh my gosh, that is going to be so hard, to take 5 minutes before the session starts and get clear in your head about what you're trying to accomplish and what you are able to do, not what you want to be able to do, but maybe there are limitations with that particular client and you're not making a lot of progress, but they're coming every week. They want to have the session. And then allowing time, a buffer between that next client where you can like slough it off and just, use whatever techniques to really just let go of that.
Yeah, I think that's super important, right? I think sometimes having realistic expectations of what we're capable of is important. And again, we all strive for perfection, right? We wish that every one of our clients would come in and have this, complete 180 when they leave us. And, often that's not the case. Clients want varying levels of change. And I think we have to accept that as well. And I know we have to wrap up. I'll just give you a real quick example. So when I
Yeah.
work with couples, early on, I used to think everybody wanted happily ever after. And, I started scaling them when they would come in. I'd say, so scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being things are at their worst, 10 being they're perfect. Where are you right now? And it was often like a 2 or a 3. And then I'd say, Okay, so let's say we meet for 5, 6 weeks and you feel like this was helpful, worthwhile. Where would you need to be on that same scale? They
Mhm.
rarely, I don't know if anybody ever said a 10. It was usually like, well, like a 7 or an 8, and I'd
Mhm.
say, so tell me about that. What would that look like? Sometimes it was a 5. It was like, well, if things are a little bit, if things at home are better, things are more calmer, there's less yelling, we're getting along, it's better for the kids, it's better for me. That's what they were looking for. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, I was thinking that everybody wanted to come in and they wanted to have this happily ever after. And it wasn't that. It was like, look,
Mm.
this is how you can help me right now. And so
Right.
I think being aware of and tempering your expectations can be really helpful for us, right? So that we're not
Right.
expecting that, right? We
Yeah.
understand that just how complicated change is.
Right. And most of the things in our field are subjective. And so to bring in some objectivity, I do brain spotting. And so we use the SUD scale. And so I think it's very beneficial to the client to learn to sort of assess, where am I now? Where do I
Mhm.
want to be? What are the things I need to get to where I want to be? Because a blood test would be great in our field, but we don't have that. So there's
Well,
other ways to bring in that objectivity.
I completely agree. And I think sort of planning and understanding, being explicit again, right? About where do we need to get provides us a roadmap because look, the average number of sessions attended is 6 to 8. Modal number is 1. And what we know is that approximately 20% of people will drop out of therapy. So it's like, why not start planning for, look, where are we going with this rather than it being this meandering thing? I think it's better for us and our clients because then the clients have a sense of, okay, so this is what we're doing.
Mhm. Yes, absolutely. And even just at that first session, explaining what's going to happen at that first session, I found is hugely helpful because they're so anxious. If they've never been in therapy, they
Yes.
have no idea what to expect.
That's so funny you say that because I often think that, like, sometimes I think of it as being a good host. And a lot of times our
Right.
clients come in and they have no idea of what to expect other than what they've seen on TV, which is usually pretty bad, right? Like,
Terrible.
so I
Terrible.
think I think it helps that relationship piece where it's like, hey, this is what this is about, right? Do you have any questions? And so on. So
Mhm.
that it puts people at ease and can be disarming.
Yeah. Yep. I agree. Okay. So as we wrap things up, I want to ask you if you have a favorite catchphrase or analogy that you like to use.
I do. Well, I have two. One is for me personally as a therapist, and my old mentor, who was just a wonderful human being. He always used to say to me, change is constant, right?
Yeah.
Because he would say he would go in and work with these families, and it would be, the families would be completely dysfunctional. And he would come out of the room, and I would be like, oh my God, that was intense. And he's like, you know what? Change is constant. Like they'll figure it out. They'll come in next week and something will be different and we'll discuss what that was. And it always stuck with me that optimism of, look, he's right. Change is constant and people are complicated. The piece that
Mhm.
I always the sort of my mantra with clients is small changes go a long way. And so
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be a complete 180. Sometimes you do one thing, one small thing, and it creates a ripple within your world, your system, and other people begin to notice it. And then, we build off of that. And it's not this sort of it doesn't have to happen overnight. But if we take a
Right.
small step, then we can take another one.
Yep, absolutely. Yes, I so appreciate both of those. Thank you for sharing them. Well, I've really enjoyed having you on. This has been a wonderful conversation. And for all of you hardworking therapists out there, please remember that our work is hard, but it doesn't have to be lonely.